Yeah, so good afternoon, everybody, and I welcome you all to this IC which says my pressures are low. Do I still have glaucoma? It's an instruction course which is going to talk on normal pressure glaucoma. But before that, we have the privilege of listening to Dr. Arun Narayan Swami, who's going to give us a keynote address on anterior segment imaging in glaucoma. With that, can I have Dr. Arun Narayan Swami share your screen, please? Can I invite Dr. Arun Narayan Swami to come on and share his screen, please?
Yeah, hello, good afternoon. I thought they're going to play my pre-recorded PowerPoint.
Well, I don't have your pre-recorded talk.
Okay, I think I should be able to do that now.
All right.
We have the pre-recorded talk now. Do you want?
Yeah,
then
please
you
play
can
that.
play that.
Yeah.
Then you can play
that. Yes. 1 second. Let me inform the AV guy. Dalchan bhai, aap ho na? Hello.
Yes. Are you?
Dalchan जी.
जी.
हाँ. कीनोट एड्रेस जो है वो प्ले करना है हमें.
पहले?
हाँ, अभी करना है. यस.
ओके.
हाँ, प्लीज प्ले कीजिए. थैंक यू.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you, Arun, to give us this keynote address on anterior segment.
Thank you so much. Good to see all very familiar faces.
Yes.
That's nice. I could come back on. My talk should be on time. They told me 10 minutes, so it'll be 10 minutes. So you should be all good with the time.
I'm sure you will be. Yes. And it's lovely to have you on our...
nice to see you all, yeah.
डालचन जी आप प्ले कर रहे हो ना?
Play the PowerPoint, please. He's playing the video. The PowerPoint is pre-recorded. If not, I will share my screen.
I think to share your screen, we will kind of save a little time.
दालचन जी ये निकाल दीजिए. सर स्क्रीन शेयर कर रहे हैं.
ओके. मैंने कर दिया यहाँ से.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes,
is my presentation live?
Yes, we can hear you, and we were able to see your screen, but now I can't see your screen. That's right. We can see your screen as well. We can't hear you. We cannot hear you. Dr. Arun, we cannot hear you.
Ma'am, Dr. Dhamankar, shall we do one thing?
Yeah.
One of the one of the speaker to present, and then we can have the keynote address.
Arun, you have not unmuted yourself, and then you can speak. Please unmute yourself.
What I do is...
now we can hear you.
We can hear you, but when your screen comes on, we can't hear you. So just make sure that your mic is not on. Just make sure that your mic is on.
Yeah, because I'm not speaking live.
Dr. Dhamankar.
Let him. I think I'll let Vinod play my video at the end of your session. I'm okay with that. Yeah.
Yes, sir,
Okay,
we'll do
thank
that.
you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dr. Damankar, please continue with the session and we shall play the address at the end of the session from our end.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, just give me a minute.
दालचन जी अभी नहीं प्ले करना है. दालचन जी अभी नहीं प्ले करना है.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
all good. Please continue.
All right. So we're going to start with looks like glaucoma. Is this normal tension glaucoma? So what is so different about normal tension glaucoma is that it is a very challenging disease. It has many nuances in diagnosis, treatment, and monitoring. It's defined as a progressing optic neuropathy with a pressure of less than 22. Our first problem is we record only a snapshot of the 24-hour IOP. So we have no idea whether the pressure that we are recording is really the pressure that is for all 24 hours. And then what is the problem? Making a diagnosis can be very challenging because glaucoma itself is complex and involves many variables. There are many other pathologies which can masquerade as glaucoma. For instance, if you look at all these pictures, it is difficult for us to say which of these is 100% glaucoma. So how do you identify normal tension glaucoma? In NTG, the optic disc rim may be significantly thinner, especially inferior temporally. The optic disc hemorrhages and parapapillary disc atrophy, particularly in the beta zone, may be more commonly observed in patients with NTG, and the visual field defects tend to be more focal. Now, if you look at this disc, you can find out that there is an inferior notching with a small superior disc hemorrhage, which is typically a NTG disc. The most important part of the diagnostic workup for NTG, because you got to do a careful and comprehensive ocular and systemic history and examination. Questions should be posed regarding any previous episodes of IOP elevation. Ocular trauma and inflammation, use of medications, especially if the patient has been using steroids in the past for a long period of time, sleep-related breathing disorders like sleep apnea, nocturnal blood pressure dips. In particularly, obstructive sleep apnea has now proven to be a very significant risk factor for NTG. You have to also look for significant history of hemodynamic crisis, for example, an acute blood loss in case of a trauma. In case of an anemia, has he had blood transfusions? Has he had some syncopal attacks? Neurological symptoms like dizziness, weakness, headache, syncope, diplopia, and loss of consciousness. There are problems with IOP itself because IOP measurements could be erroneous. IOP is known to have diurnal variations. Peaks of IOP are always outside of office hours, and IOP is dependent on the corneal thickness. So you might be recording an IOP which is seemingly low, but which is actually not low. So you have to take into consideration all of these things before you decide that it is an NTG. The intraocular pressure should be less than 21. The defects are focal. There could be a focal knot, an optic disc pit, a visual field defect close to fixation, or a disc hemorrhage, often associated with vasospastic disorders like migraine and Raynaud's, and may be associated with nocturnal hypotension or sleep apnea. There are common masquerades which look like NTG, and these include compressive or infiltrative lesions of the optic nerve, previous ischemic optic neuropathy, both arthritic and non-arthritic. There could be congenital and hereditary optic neuropathies. There could be post-traumatic optic neuropathy, inflammatory and demyelinating optic neuritis, and high myopia. Many disc anomalies like optic disc hyperplasia, optic disc pit, drusen, myopia quite often resembles glaucoma, and optic discs which show more pallor than cupping like in AION or in neurological pathologies do look like glaucoma. And here are pictures of various masqueraders, and if you just have a one ballpoint look at these discs might be very confusing and you might be tempted to call them glaucoma. So you have to be able to differentiate a glaucomatous disc from a non-glaucomatous disc. In a glaucomatous disc, you normally have polar notching. The pink rim, if it is present, might be seen. There could be a rim obliteration. There is definitely less pallor, and there could be a peripapillary halo. Whereas in a non-glaucomatous disc, you would have more pallor. Rim pallor is really marked. It could be associated with other findings like less vision and vascular changes. Now, in chiasmal compressions, that is the intracranial space-occupying lesions which give rise to chiasmal compression could be pituitary adenomas, craniopharyngiomas, supracellular aneurysms, or meningiomas. Many such tumors will be present in patients who are younger than the average glaucoma patient. So patients with compressive injury may show visual field defects which resemble glaucoma with acute or nerve fiber bundle loss and shallow optic disc cupping. The optic nerve pallor is in excess of cupping, particularly of the temporal rim. And neurological defects that are seen in this fashion, a vertical step defect in the visual field, should alert the clinician of a possible compression or an infiltration, as should also a central scotoma or decreased acuity. Now, these are various lesions that look like glaucoma, but if you look at the color vision, that might give you an acquired loss of color vision, might indicate a neurological condition such as an optic neuropathy. The presence of an RAPD may also indicate a neurologic disease. Now, this is a case of a 47-year-old patient who comes for a routine checkup with best corrected visual acuity of 6/6 with pressures which are normal. The anterior segment is normal. Both eyes show you temporal pallor. The visual field shows you a bitemporal hemianopia, and on an MRI, a pituitary adenoma has been picked up. Common mistakes that we see is old ischemic optic neuropathies. They may present with a nerve fiber bundle field loss if seen after the swelling resolves. Now look at this patient who had come to us with a disc swelling to start with, and after the disc swelling had gone on, 3 years later when we saw her again, this was what her disc looked like, and this is the kind of the visual field defect that we saw. Now here is a patient who comes to us with a history of diminished vision. She noticed since a couple of months that she also had an occasional headache. She had best corrected visual of 6/12 and 6/9 with N6. Her anterior segment was within normal limits. Her gonioscopy showed us wide open angles and her pressures were 20 and 18. But when we did her perimetry, we saw this defect and hence we got her scan, and this is what we found, a pituitary adenoma. Marked neural rim pallor in excess of cupping, marked focal arterial narrowing near the disc, history of acute loss of vision with headache, jaw claudication, weight loss, anorexia, and fever is common in an anterior ischemic optic neuropathy. And the involved eye may also have an altitudinal pallor without cupping but with retinal arterial narrowing, such as is seen over here. There are other mimickers like autosomal dominant optic atrophies, optic nerve head pits, colobomas, optic nerve hyperplasia, Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy. All of these can mimic glaucoma, and a careful history and the duration or progression of the clinical findings are normally helpful clues in establishing the correct diagnosis. This is what a Leber's looks like, where you have hyperemia, you have an elevation, there is a thick peripapillary retina, and there is peripapillary telangiectasia with unexplained visual loss. Now, this is an optic disc pit. You can actually identify the pit very easily, but if you look at the field, it almost mimics glaucoma, and if you don't search for the pit, you might miss it. There are optic disc colobomas, there is a morning glory syndrome, there could be an optic disc drusen, there could be a hypoplasia of the optic nerve, there could be a myopia. And in myopia, the best thing to do is to look for optic nerve head changes over time, over the fundus, look for the macular changes seen on an OCT and see if the visual field changes are progressing. If it is not so, then it is more likely to be just myopia. There could be methanol toxicity, wherein you see a young male who comes with a sudden loss of vision after ingesting alcohol. Old non-progressive glaucoma is something that you have to look for, because there could be a patient who has had either a burnt out pigmentary glaucoma or an old steroid responder or an old uveitic glaucoma where the defect is left forever, but it is a non-progressive disease. And if you ask for the history and if you do a good slit lamp examination, you will be able to know that this is an old burnt out disease. In conclusion, not all discs which resemble glaucoma are actually glaucoma, and not all eyes with normal pressures mimicking glaucoma are glaucoma. Taking a detailed history, doing a good comprehensive examination speaks volumes in terms of diagnosing normal tension glaucoma. Thank you very much for your time. With this, can I invite Dr. Sunil Jain? Sunil Jain will be talking to us on how will he deal with a patient with NTG who also has systemic hypotension. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah,
I'll just stop sharing my screen in a minute.
Sure. Okay, is the screen visible?
Yeah.
Yeah, fine. Okay, so thank you, Rita, for having me at this instruction course. And good afternoon, everybody. So before we address a patient of normal tension glaucoma, we have to realize the multifactorial pathophysiology behind this disease, and hence I'll just take you briefly through it. And we are all aware that the CNTG trial showed us that almost 20% of the patients continue to progress in spite of achieving the target intraocular pressure. And hence the concept basically of non-IOP dependent factors was put forth. Now, as you can see, the optic nerve head biomechanics, basically, or the connective tissue of the optic nerve head are dependent on IOP-related stress or non-IOP related stress. Now, IOP-related stress can primarily affect the connective tissue and cause deformation, and also secondarily by affecting the blood flow and the nutrient supply within the optic nerve head. The non-IOP-related factors such as autoimmune or inflammatory insults and the retrobulbar optic nerve head blood flow affect primarily the connective tissues and also make it vulnerable to the secondary effect of the IOP factors. So the non-IOP systemic risk factors, which I will be discussing, are mainly the systemic hypertension and its management, resulting in hypotension, and the nocturnal hypotension. Now, we all are aware that in systemic blood pressure, we have the systolic blood pressure and the diastolic blood pressure. The diastolic blood pressure is very essential for tissue perfusion. And as soon as the diastolic blood pressure falls below 70 millimeters of mercury, that means there's insufficiency. This can result in damage to end organs. So the management, so the management of systemic hypertension itself can be a risk factor in the normal tension glaucoma. And how is that? Because we all are aware that reducing elevated blood pressure is essential to reduce the cardiovascular complications. There are different target blood pressures which have been recommended for different patient population. And what they found is the risk of death because of IHD or stroke is lowest if the blood pressure is in the range of 115/75. And for every 20 millimeters mercury rise in the blood pressure, that is systolic blood pressure, the risk increased or doubled. The recommendations from these groups, that is the JNC committee 8 guidelines, which say that most patients should achieve a goal of less than 150/90. But if the patient has associated diabetes or CKD, the blood pressure should be less than 140/90. In a different trial, which is the SPRINT trial, what they try to do is reduce the systolic blood pressure to much lower levels, that is less than 120 millimeters of mercury. And they achieved a very significant reduction in the cardiac events. But the problem was it is associated with the higher rates of other adverse events, such as hypotension, syncope, electrolyte abnormalities, and kidney failures. Okay, so though lowering blood pressure is good, but excessive is harmful not to the body, but even to our eye patients. Hence, the concept of nocturnal hypotension. We all are aware that the blood pressure, even in normal patients, normally decreases during sleep at night by about 10 to 20%. And in this study, what they did is they classified the glaucoma patients into depending on the dipping of the nocturnal the nocturnal dip. So if there is just a 10% dip, the patient was classified as a non-dipper, 10 to 20% was a dipper, and more than 20% was an extreme dipper. And what they found is was higher incidence of visual field progression over 4 years in the extreme dipper group. In this study, basically what they realized is they analyzed is in all patients of normal tension glaucoma, they measure the arterial pressure while awake and while asleep. And then they created this line, which was the mean arterial pressure while awake. And then they analyzed the nocturnal blood pressure in comparison with the mean arterial pressure while awake. Okay. And they analyzed how low, that is how low and how long did the diurnal nocturnal fluctuation occurred. And they found a significant correlation between the visual field progression with the length of the time and the magnitude of the drop in the nocturnal blood pressure. To give an example, if the blood pressure was only a few millimeters of mercury below the mean arterial pressure, but for a longer duration, there was a less risk of progression. But if the blood pressure drop or the nocturnal dip was more than about 30 to 40 millimeters, but only for a few hours, it had a higher risk. So drop in the blood pressure, nocturnal blood pressure is very important. This was one more study which analyzed patients of glaucoma in which the visual field progressed as compared to visual fields where the visual fields were stable. And they monitored a 24-hour systolic blood pressure and the diastolic blood pressure. And they found this line to be the mean nocturnal blood pressure, and this was the trough. So they found that the nocturnal hypotension, which was determined by this mean nighttime blood pressure and the trough in the systolic and the diastolic, resulted in a greater visual field progression as compared to patients which did not have these nocturnal dips. So autoregulation is the body's way of maintaining the perfusion in the key organs such as brain and heart when the blood pressure drops. So as soon as the blood pressure drops, there's vasoconstriction. This reduces the blood flow to the less critical organs such as the eye and maintains adequate perfusion to key organs such as brain and the heart. This results in ischemia and optic nerve damage to our patients. So apart from the vascular factors, the IOP also is important, and we all are aware of the diurnal fluctuation in intraocular pressures. And this study found that the IOP in supine position was more than in the seated position, and the IOP nocturnal supine IOP was again higher than the daytime sitting IOP. Okay, so are we missing something? Yes, we are missing the IOP spikes, because we tend to measure daytime intraocular pressures, but we are knowing that it's the nocturnal IOP which is higher than the daytime IOP. We measure the pressure in sitting position, in spite of being aware the supine IOP is more than the sitting IOP. Single IOP measurements from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. had a 75% chance of missing the highest point of diurnal curve. So coming to the normal tension glaucoma related glaucomatous optic neuropathy, the main factors contributing are the mechanical, that is IOP related, and the vascular. And coming to vascular, the main problem is the decrease in the ocular blood flow. And how does this happen? Either the blood pressure reduces, which will result in a lower perfusion pressure, or the IOP rises, which again results in a low perfusion pressure. And this results in a low blood flow and ischemia. So apart from the ophthalmic examination, a general medical examination like a 24-hour blood pressure monitoring to rule out nocturnal hypertension is very essential. A carotid druid might indicate a carotid insufficiency. It is essential to even evaluate the diastolic perfusion pressure. As Rita had mentioned, some blood tests to rule out vitamin B12 deficiency, folate deficiency, for ruling out other causes of optic neuropathy, an MRI to rule out intracranial space occupying lesions, a nail fold capillaroscopy with cold provocation may detect blood flow abnormalities. Now, coming to management, so if a patient has an excessive nocturnal diastolic blood pressure dip, and if the patient is on oral antihypertensives, we will have to reduce the blood pressure aggressiveness targets. Okay, and if the patient is not on antihypertensives, you might have to give him certain aerobic exercises, nocturnal salt loading, or sufficient water drinking might improve the dip. In addition to that, treatment of any cardiovascular abnormalities is essential to increase the optic nerve perfusion. Are topical drugs effective in IOP lowering? Beta blockers are not very effective in the night. And nocturnal IOP lowering is much better with prostaglandin and dorzolamide. And as this graph shows, where they analyzed in the daytime, that is morning 8 to evening 8, the latanoprost, the effect was almost similar as timolol on the diurnal effect. But in the night time, the latanoprost has a better effect than timolol. Dorzolamide was similar as latanoprost, and dorzolamide was better than brimonidine. So in conclusion, in view of the multifactorial pathophysiology, patients with progressive normal tension glaucoma should be managed along with a physician. Thank you.
Such a great job, because you looked at everything that you have to look at in a patient with NTG on the systemic front. I'm very, very grateful to you for having participated. Now, can I call upon Meenakshi Dhar? Dr. Meenakshi Dhar was originally from Kerala, has now moved back to Delhi, and Meenakshi is going to talk to us on when is it essential to ask for ocular perfusion studies and sleep apnea studies. Can I get Meenakshi to please join?
Yeah, hi. And thank you, Dr. Rita, and thank you to the scientific committee for having this interesting IC. And to begin with, Dr. Sunil has made my job easier, and because he's discussed part of what I would be speaking. And when do we test for ocular perfusion and sleep apnea? Whenever we find that the glaucoma progression is and this would we all know that glaucoma damage may be caused by vascular factors like low perfusion pressure and ocular blood flow, and these conditions could affect not only the occurrence but the progression of the disease. And there are several studies in which have found that alterations in systemic and ocular hemodynamics plays a significant role in the progression and development of the disease. Before we go on to further, we should always revisit our diagnosis, check for patient compliance, and ensure that we have not missed the angle closure component if the patient has been on follow-up with us for a long time. I would begin with my discussion with this 80-year-old lady who was on a 10-year-old follow-up. She was her IOPs were never more than 15. She had a very good compliance.
Meenakshi, your slides are not moving. Sorry to interrupt you.
For me, they are moving. What do we do? Shall I stop share and come back again?
Can the IT team please help us? Yeah, we can see you now, Meenakshi, but your slides were not moving.
Yeah, I'll just see if it does. Is it?
Yeah, now I can see.
Now, let me see if it moves.
You're on your first, yeah.
Yeah. So without having to repeat this, I will go on to discussing this patient who had an asymmetric visual field loss, more in the right eye, and her IOPs were always normal. We did an ocular blood flow for this patient, and we found that the resistive index was high in the right eye. And we started the patient on a carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, and lo and behold, we could see actually not only that the progression had halted, but the vision had improved. The fields had improved. From 2019, she had to actually stop AZOPT as she was intolerant to it because of dermatitis. And we can again now see that the patient has progressed. Again, now we have started the patient on dorzolamide. This patient, we all know that there are lots of patients who progress despite IOP control, and it has been substantiated by many population-based studies. And the ocular blood flow is the distribution of oxygenated blood supply throughout the vasculature to the eye. The average blood flow is lesser in glaucoma, and there is a decreased blood flow is correlated with visual field defects. And as we will, the ocular blood flow is reduced in the retrobulbar, the retinal, the optic nerve head, and in the choroidal circulations. And it may be actually the first deficit which occurs, which is the first manifestation of glaucoma. There are many vascular risk factors, apart from the systemic ones, which Dr. Sunil has already discussed. There is the aging of the vasculature. There is the ocular perfusion pressure, which he had alluded to. Also, there is a reduction of ocular blood flow, and a fluctuating and unstable blood flow. Also dysregulation of ocular blood flow, which may occur in patients with vasospasm, either because of migraine or the recently introduced Flamer syndrome, and also due to a certain hypovolemia. When we look at think of the glaucoma as a type of ischemic optic neuropathy, we also find that the abnormal optic nerve perfusion pressure has been known to play a major role in the pathogenesis of normal tension glaucoma. And 20 to 60% of our Indian population in varying areas is an NTG. So we should look at this aspect of patients' glaucoma. And we know that as a person ages, there is the increased resistivity of the index of the retrobulbar vessels, and this leads to a decrease of thalamic, arterial, and systolic velocity, and decreased ocular blood flow. Also, with aging, there is progressive decrease in the thickness of the choroid, and this also decreases the circulation. And the 47% of the glaucoma patients have systemic hypertension. This already Dr. Sunil has covered very well. I will not go ahead with this. But we also know that patients who are diabetics have a vascular damage and vascular disturbances of the optic nerve, and their autoregulation is affected. So in these patients also, we should look at their ocular blood flow. Then again, patients who have migraine, and they have in their elevated levels of endothelial-1, which is a powerful vasoconstrictor, which may be causing vasospasms and disturbed vascular autoregulation. And in these patients also, we should do a ocular blood flow. And the low ocular perfusion pressure also has been identified as an independent risk factor for glaucoma progression. We calculate the ocular OPP by the mean OPP by adding the DBP to 1/3 of the difference between the systolic and the diastolic blood pressure. Normal OPP is between 41 to 61, and a low mean OPP has been associated with glaucoma progression when the IOP is normal. And there are many population-based studies which have found that there is a 2 to 6-fold increase in the incidence of open-angle glaucoma with the diastolic OPP being less than 55. And this is substantiated by many other population-based studies. Also, there is the ocular perfusion pressure is reduced in POAG. There is a lower diastolic perfusion pressure, which is a new predictor for disease progression. There is 50% rise in risk for progression. Vascular abnormalities are an important risk factor both for development and progression of glaucoma. Athletes, although they have low OPP, they have a good autoregulation, hence they do not have any problems. Patients who have Flamer syndrome, they are the ones who have a long increase in the long-term fluctuation of visual fields, and they are generally people with low body mass index with a low BP. And it has been found that they do have vasospastic syndrome, cold extremities, which Dr. Sunil had also alluded to. And these people can have a multitude of ocular problems apart from NTG, AION, and vein occlusions, etc. So we should think of doing OBP in such patients. And now coming to the effect of anti-glaucoma medications on ocular blood flow, timolol does not affect ocular blood flow. Apraclonidine has a deleterious effect on the retrobulbar circulation. The other beta blockers like the levobulinol, bitoxolol, and also the brimonidine, latanoprost, acetazolamide, and topical CAIs increase the ocular blood flow. Also, bitoxolol, cartilol, latanoprost, and bimatoprost decrease the resistance of blood vessels. Acetazolamide and uniprostron have found to be have anti-endothelin 1 effect, and bimatoprost increases the OPP, as well as it decreases the RI. And so both prostaglandin analogs can be used to improve ocular blood flow. The major focus of ocular blood flow has been seen that CIAs increase the blood flow velocities in the central retinal artery as well as the short posterior ciliary arteries, but not in the ophthalmic arteries. Carbonic anhydrase inhibitors do cause vasoprotection. They improve the autoregulation and also increase the choroidal blood flow. And there are many studies which have been done on, more studies have been done on dorzolamide, and a meta-analysis of the same has put forward that there is an increased blood flow velocities and decreased vascular resistance in the retinal circulation by using the CAIs. They also improve the ocular blood flow and delay the visual field progression. They also shorten the AVP time. In comparison between dorzolamide versus brinzolamide, dorzolamide has a 6.5 times more affinity for the carbonic anhydrase 4. But brinzolamide improves the peripapillary retina blood flow and is probably more gentler to the cornea. And there is one study which found it to be more efficacious. Now, brimonidine also enhances the autoregulation. So one can use either of these. There are some systemic drugs also which increase ocular blood flow, which is the trandrofil, dipyrimidol, ginkgo biloba, and magnesium. Their effect can be utilized. Now, how do we measure the blood flow is the one which is most prevalent and most often used just now is using the color Doppler imaging. And here we can identify the central retinal artery, the short posterior, lateral, and temporal arteries, and the ophthalmic arteries, and calculate the vascular, the end-diastolic volume, velocity, the peak systolic velocity. But the factor which is most important is the resistive index, which is actually a ratio and has been found to be correlating with the ocular blood flow. It is one of the most reliable parameters on OBF, and greater than 0.76 is considered as a high RI. Progression of visual fields correlates with high RI in POAG as well as in NTG, but not in angle closure patients. This was one of our studies which we had done where we took glaucoma patients with open angles with 4 or more visual fields, and they found progression on visual fields. And we found that patients who had progression were put on carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, and we could actually correlate between low OPP, where we could actually find that these patients, the visual fields improved once we had put them on CAIs. I will not go into these examples. Coming on to nocturnal hypotension and sleep apnea, they both may contribute to fluctuating ocular perfusion. Obstructive sleep apnea disorder is characterized by repetitive episodes of shallow breathing, and this increases 10 times more likely to develop glaucoma. The literature on this is very, it tells us that there is a prevalence of NTG in obstructive sleep apnea syndrome. In a patient with NTG, there is controlled IOP with progression. Whenever there is high BMI or there is a history of suggestive of sleep disorder, we should investigate them, and we should take a good, accurate history of this of sleep, and we should refer such patients with sleep disturbance for polysomnography. But what was actually found when they tried to put a contact lens which could measure the IOP while the sleep study was on, was that the IOP actually decreases during the apneic episodes. So the high IOP was actually found more related to the obesity, the supine position during sleep, and raised ICT. So what they found was the visual field defects were actually due to retinal ischemia in the apneic phase and not due to the IOP changes. So there were associations between glaucoma and abnormal. I'll just take half a minute. Abnormal sleep duration and sleep latency and daytime dysfunction. High IOP due to related and the high diurnal variation was found in patients who were put on CPAP machine to cure the sleep apnea, and in them there is a more than 10 times higher risk of glaucoma. So patients of sleep apnea who are put onto CPAP, they're the ones who should be followed up for glaucoma. There have been OCT changes found in patients who have sleep apnea. There is thinning of RNFL, and especially there are different studies. Some have found the supratemporal thinning to be more important. There were others in which they found that the inferior quadrant and thinning was more often seen, and the temporal quadrant thinning was least often involved. And there are patients who have floppy eyelid syndrome, and this could be an indicator of glaucoma in patients of sleep apnea. This was our study which we had done, and in that we found a very high incidence of glaucoma in our sleep apneic patients, but it could also be skewed because we had actually taken, it's a very small group. So in nutshell, I'd like to say that systemic hypertension, all these things together, if they are present, we should do an ocular blood flow. The take-home message is that POAG is associated with an alteration in factors related to OBF and a breakdown of autoregulation. When progression occurs in spite of controlled IOP, vascular factors should be emphasized upon, and treatment should be emphasized. Glaucoma medication should also be evaluated on the ability to increase OPP and blood flow. In future, we may have a normative database of blood flow parameters, and which may help us to look at these much in a better way. And also maybe medications like statins would be used to improve the ocular blood flow as well. Thank you for patient hearing.
Thank you, Meenakshi. That was a very, very comprehensive explanation on ocular blood flow. There was a little less time for the sleep apnea though, but I appreciate that you spent a lot of time and you gave a lot of importance to what we were actually looking at. And thank you very much. Now can I invite Dr. Mayuri Kamar? She's going to talk to us on, you've seen a disc hemorrhage. What do you do? And what does it mean? Mayuri, will you please come in? Thank you.
Rita. I will be talking on a disc hemorrhage. What does it mean and what should I do when I see one? The glaucoma is a gradually progressing and somewhat uneventful disease, and the presence of splinter hemorrhage could be a dramatic event for us. Trans hemorrhage or the optic nerve splinter hemorrhage is always with the association of both functional and structural damage, and one of the most powerful independent risk factor for the glaucoma progression. It could be a splinter or the flame-shaped hemorrhage oriented perpendicular to the optic disc margin, or round or blotchy, And usually it is within the 1 disc diameter of the optic disc margin. Now, if we look at the prevalence in the normal population, the various studies have shown that it was ranging between 0.6 to 1.4 only. While if we look at the glaucoma population, the open angle glaucoma Blue Mountain Eye study has shown the prevalence of the disc hemorrhage was 13.8%, but it was more prominent with the low pressure glaucoma, that was 25%. Similarly, the Japanese study has also shown very high prevalence, 20.5% in the low tension glaucoma. If we look at the incidence of disc hemorrhage, the OAT study, which has a now 13 years follow-up public is there. So if ocular hypertension is there alone, then the probability of incidence of the disc hemorrhage is 0.5% per year. But after conversion to the primary open angle glaucoma, the incidence is 1.2%. So overall low prevalence of disc hemorrhage in the population-based study limits our usefulness of the disc hemorrhage screening for the tool for the glaucoma. Now, what is the exact etiology? It's not well understood still, but the theories of mechanical or the ischemic damage is being put forward. With the OCT angio, we know that there is a peripapillary choroidal microvascular dropout seen with the glaucoma patients. So eye who had a disc hemorrhage, the dropout was seen at the site of hemorrhage in 46%, while eyes without hemorrhage, it was almost 30%. So it is a subset of the disc hemorrhage, maybe a relation to the deformation of the lamina fibrosa pores in the glaucoma due to reactive gliosis in the glaucoma patients when there is a gliotic scar formation which pulls this pore. So what does it mean when there is a disc hemorrhage in the patient? Suppose patient has no glaucoma, it is a chance finding otherwise. So in that case, the chances of this patient to convert to the glaucoma is only 30%. But if eye has ocular hypertension, then after 13 years of cumulative incidence of ocular hypertensive converting to the POAG, the disc hemorrhage was seen with the 25.6% of patients. So there is a definite increased chance of converting or developing glaucoma in all glaucoma suspects or in the normals. While glaucoma patients having a disc hemorrhage, there is an increased risk of the progression of the glaucoma in form of perimetric progression or disc changes, RGC loss or RNFL thinning. In normal tension glaucoma patient, the disc hemorrhage at the time of study enrollment, I have not quoted the name of the person who did this study. The risk factor for the perimetric progression is there with the CNGT trial. So it is an independent risk factor for the perimetric progression for both primary open angle glaucoma cases as well as NTG cases. Other two trials or studies has also shown that there is a faster retinal ganglion cell loss over an average study period for nearly 4 years. Now, what should we do if there is a disc hemorrhage? Basically, disc hemorrhage are easy to miss if you are not specially looking for them, because it's tiny and you may not be looking for it. So a high magnification with a convex lens on the slit lamp biomicroscopy, it is possible to see them. The fundus photograph, many a times you have not seen with the 90D, but with the fundus photograph, you can identify and always draw or take the photograph of the patients for the further follow-up. Posterior segment imaging in such condition can be an adjunct. And location usually is infratemporal in NTG patient, or it could be supratemporal. And in NTG, these hemorrhages are larger and longer compared to the high pressure glaucoma. What I suggest is the periodically dilate the patient and take photograph that will help us in improving our detection of the disc hemorrhage. How can we improve our detection? Then increase the surveillance of this patient. Look at the area which are likely to be affected near the RNFL defect or near rim notching, or on the temporal side or near the beta zone peripapillary atrophy. make a particular effort to seek this hemorrhage. And this is how you can document them in the peripapillary hemorrhage or the neuroretinal rim hemorrhage or parapapillary hemorrhage. It's a classic case of ocular hypertensive patient who developed the disc hemorrhage, and after 18, at that time, patient never had any field defect or the imaging defect, RNFL defect. After 18 months of the this event, the OCT started showing a small area of the RNFL loss in the area of the disc hemorrhage. So how to differentiate it with the other conditions who also can have disc hemorrhage, like diabetic retinopathy or the optic nerve head drusen or any vascular diseases of the retina, systemic hypertension. And this previous speaker has already covered that these are the patients where there is a non-glaucomatous optic neuropathy. You can have a various finding like tortuosity of the vessels or the disc edema or retinal abnormality that will help us in the diagnosis. Now, intrapapillary hemorrhage may or may not be with the glaucoma. It's common near the nasal border of the nerve and seen with the myopic eye with the tilted disc. It could be a spontaneous event or it can be a precipitation of acute disc edema or following Valsalva maneuver. Now, this is a case of a female patient, very well controlled for the primary open angle glaucoma. Incidentally, we saw the intrapapillary hemorrhage when she came for the follow-up. And we found out by taking the detailed history that recently she has been coughing a lot because of the upper respiratory infection, and that could be because of the possibility of the Valsalva maneuver. Now, these are some of the associations, systemic associations that are there, could be with the disc hemorrhage. And the study was conducted for ocular as well as systemic associations which could lead to recurrent disc hemorrhage in the primary open angle glaucoma. And it has been found out that the lower percentage reduction of the IOP from baseline could be one of the ocular risk factors. Cold extremities or the lateral or the prone position in the slip or the sleep apnea could be also a risk factor for the recurrence of the disc hemorrhage. Now, exfoliation needs a special mention here because disc hemorrhage is seen to have an independent risk factor for the progression in the pseudoexfoliation glaucoma. And how do we manage this condition? In non-glaucomatous eye with the disc hemorrhage, glaucoma suspect, you have to investigate them thoroughly for the glaucoma or start considering them as a glaucoma. If there is an early identification of the glaucoma and subsequently there is a significant IOP reduction, then you can prevent the further visual loss. And if individual with the known case of glaucoma develops the disc hemorrhage, it is a sign of active disease and the progression needs to initiate or intensify your IOP lowering treatment. And effect of the treatment is always seen, that studies have shown that there is a decrease in the incidence of the disc frequency of the recurrence of the disc hemorrhage. So seemingly well-controlled glaucoma patient comes to you with the acceptable IOP and there is a new disc hemorrhage. What does it mean or what I should do? If the patient is merely a glaucoma suspect, initiate the anti-glaucoma medication. If the prevalence of optic nerve hemorrhage is very less that we saw in my first slide in the non-glaucomatous eye. So when there is a disc hemorrhage, it could be a sign of the positivity. And this hemorrhage only last minute. The trabeculectomy has a very good effect. Only 5.5% post-trabeculectomy patient experience the disc hemorrhage, while pre-operatively 33.4% of them had disc hemorrhage. So to conclude, tough to spot, but they may herald a disc progression. So we have to improve our detection skill. It indicates that disease is still active and you need to respond accordingly. And do one thing: first, change your surveillance, and second, consider advancing the treatment. A sign that the patient status is not what I am thinking of, maybe more serious. Suspect patient should be on the treatment. Many of the patient may be, you can add one medicine or do SLT, and I will change my level of surveillance. I will call my patient more frequently. So take home is Disc hemorrhage is a sign of damage rather than something that we need to treat. It will usually go away on its own within 4 months. It's a question of treating the patient, not the hemorrhage. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayuri. That was very comprehensive, very well described. Lots of research done into disc hemorrhage, and I'm very, very grateful to you. Thank you for accepting my invitation as well. And now, can I request Dr. Manish Shah to please come on? Manish is going to talk to us on role of medical management in normal tension glaucoma.
So
Manish,
good afternoon, everybody. Can you see my slides and hear me as well?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so the topic which I was to speak on was factors to consider for medical treatment for NTG. So I am making a correction. It is not a talk on medical treatment. I have not gone that far. These factors which you need to consider. So the first thing we have to keep in mind is that NTG is a disease condition which has varying progression rates. So it is important information from the CNTG study which showed that more than 50% of the patients in the NTG group, even in the observation group who were not treated for 7 years, did not show any progression. So there was a very large number of patients who did not progress. And those who progress, the rates can vary from very slow progression to only very small percentage are really rapid progressors. So this is very important factor right at the outset we need to confirm. And already Rita has talked right in the beginning that NTG is a diagnosis of exclusion and has many masquerades. And this is probably the reason why you see non-progression, because how much ever you try, some of these get included into your group of diagnosed as NTG. This is my take on the whole thing, because sometimes you cannot get the history that well and exclude that these are actually burnt out glaucomas and not active disease conditions. So confirming your diagnosis is a very important factor. Once you have seen that this is not a confounder and this is a patient of suspected NTG, whom are you going to treat and how aggressively? What practically I recommend that we do is classify the patients into 3 categories at the time of initial therapy itself. The group 1 is that those who have no immediate fixation threat, who are generally people of an older age group. What is older? My cutout is 75 years. IOP in lower teens. So these are not patients who have IOPs in the higher teens. They are normal tension. So definitely it's not about 21. And there aren't any other risk factors. This is the first group, which is a very mild group, which you don't have a very high risk of going into a visual disability as years go by. The second group is visual field changes showing moderate changes. IOP is also a little bit higher in the mid or higher teens, and they are active middle age, and maybe some risk factors are also there. So these are patients whom you are a little more concerned. The third group are patients who have relatively advanced visual field defects. Some of them, the fixation is already involved or threatened. And if they are younger and one-eyed patients. So these are the group where you are very, very highly concerned that you don't want progression to occur. So this is the kind of the first group I mentioned. Maybe the slide is, the magnification is too less, but the patient is 76 years old. And as you can see that there is an inferior occult scotoma, but the pressures are not very high. They are around 11, 12. And there is no immediate problem here. And patient is old enough and he is already having cardiovascular disease. He may be left alone, untreated, or maybe just a single medication. But definitely you observe closely, because in all types of glaucoma, you can never stand and be overconfident, because you don't know which one will turn around and challenge you as time goes. So you may not be thinking that this is a very aggressive progressor, but he can be, because you don't know what exactly is going on behind. So you repeat visual fields and disc evaluations at least once in 4 to 6 months. This is a patient, sorry, I don't know where it group. This is group, this is the second group. Visual field changes are moderate. As you can see, this may be that this appears a little milder than the earlier field, but you see the age of the patient is 58. And this patient had IOPs which were ranging from 18 to 20. So this patient with the field involved definitely looking glaucomatous, you would not like to treat this patient on observation alone. So you would definitely start treatment and you would target at least 20 to 30% reduction from baseline. You cannot put absolute figures when you are talking about a normal tension glaucoma, but you better put it as a 30% reduction from baseline. So that would be coming to around 4 to 5 millimeters of mercury. So it is 18. So you would like to bring it down definitely to 14 or 13 or 14. And this can be achieved by a single drop, or if some in the CNGT, they did ALT also. So in some, it is recommended some people who can't tolerate medications or have challenges to put medications, you can go in directly for SLT or ALT, or you have a combination of the two. The third group are the patients who are very much your highest concern group. They have the advanced visual field defects. Most of the patients already have the fixation involved, already tubular. And if they are younger, as you can see, this is the field and the patient is 39 years old. She's not one-eyed, but she's 39 years old. So you have to be very concerned about this because this can progress and then you will really have visual disability during the lifetime of this patient. So you have to have a very aggressive target, and probably 30% is also the baseline, but you would like to go even to 35% from baseline. And medical therapy, maybe just one drug may not be enough. You may be compounding it with ALT, SLT, or maybe you would like to put on a combination. However, trabeculectomy and other surgical interventions, I think Dr. Venkatesh is going to discuss whether there is a role for other interventions, are not directly, never in normal tension glaucoma can you take the liberty of directly advising surgery because you don't know how this patient is really going to behave. So I would say that in the initial period, you would definitely like to observe. But if you see that there is failure of medical therapy and progression despite therapy, then you would be very consciously considering to do surgery. Now, if you have decided to treat, what is the choice or medical therapy which you choose? Now, you have heard all the speakers before me, and therefore I am going to talk this a little bit more concise because they have already, Meenakshi has discussed about how the prostaglandins and the carbonic anhydrase are supposed to have some benefit on the ocular blood flow. Here we are preferring to use prostaglandin analogs by far as the first choice of drugs. Now, what are the other choices? Alpha agonists are shown to have probably some neuroprotective effect, and the LOGIT study, which was a study which was done on normal tension glaucoma subgroup and treated with beta blockers and alpha agonists. And over a 7-year period, they showed that for similar pressure levels, the patients on alpha agonists seem to have better visual field stability than those on beta blockers. There were some limitations to the study because there was a big loss of patients due to allergies to alpha agonists. But this is the result which is in front of us. And therefore, we are saying that alpha agonists do have some role to play, especially if your patient is able to tolerate them. As far as beta blockers are concerned, in my opinion, we generally like to avoid that in view of the LOGIT study. And there are reports about ocular blood flow, is that reduces ocular blood flow. And there are some reports which show that it does not have any effect on the blood flow. So the jury is out. I cannot say for conclusive that it reduces blood flow, but definitely it doesn't seem to be any benefit. And last important point, I think Dr. Sunil mentioned this, is that they are not effective during the night period, and nocturnal hypotension and hypoperfusion seem to be very important factors in NTG, even more than your other glaucoma patients. So generally beta blockers are put on the back burner, and they are not drugs which we generally jump at when we are treating. Topical carbonic anhydrase as a monotherapy, they are not going to be sufficient to give you the 30, 25, 30 and 35% reduction from baseline that you need. So they're going to be add-on with the specific benefit of some possible vasoprotection that they can offer. However, as I think Dr. Meenakshi showed that they do have problems of tolerability, and maybe brinzolamide may do better than dorzolamide. Nocturnal IOP is something which you would like to consider, and as we have discussed, the prostaglandin analogs and the carbonic anhydrase inhibitors are the drugs which seem to be having some effect. So in your treatment armamentarium, these seem to be very much top on your pecking order. So we have to consider neuroprotection and vasoprotection in this subgroup of patients. The newest group of drugs, that is the Rho kinase inhibitors, I have not covered in my talk, but because they are still new and we don't know whether they have any special preference in the normal tension glaucoma scenario. However, when you want to do everything you can and you want to add them, you may do that. Of course, you have to keep in mind the risk factors which have already been discussed in extent, the nocturnal hypotension and sleep apnea. So I am not going to discuss that anymore. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manish. That was a very concise talk. I mean, I'm sorry I forgot to mention that you were just going to talk factors related to medical management. That was my original thought, and you did excellent justice to the topic. With this, can I invite Dr. Venkatesh, please? He's going to talk to us on a totally different topic. Now, if nothing works and you've got to opt for surgery, he's going to tell us whether there is any role of minimally invasive glaucoma surgery before we go to our age-old filtering surgery in normal tension glaucoma. All yours, Dr. Venkatesh.
So I am going to today talk about surgical options for normal tension glaucoma. Do we have any role for minimally invasive glaucoma surgery? And I am Dr. Venkatesh from Aravind Eye Hospital, Pondicherry. As glaucoma surgeons, we are always looking at something which is very safe, at the same time less invasive, and also has got a very quick recovery because our patients need that. At this point of time, if you take any mix, who will benefit? Mainly patients who have open angle, whether they have mild to moderate damage or normal or low pressure, they should be open angle. And definitely there is a role for normal tension glaucoma, and also patients who have ocular hypertension and patients with early glaucoma but who need a cataract surgery. We can combine a MIGS. And any patients who have ocular surface disorders and not tolerating glaucoma medications. When you talk about mix, these are the options which are available. Subconjunctival drainage, we have the Zen implant. When we talk about enhancing the Schlemm's canal outflow, we have several options, starting from trabectome, iStent, Hydrus, gonioscopy-assisted transluminal trabeculotomy, Cahook's dual blade. And there's another way you can think of is suprachoroidal outflow. You have iStent Supra, and CyPass was available, but no more. And then finally, there are options which can also cause destruction to the ciliary body. So the viable options at this point of time, which we are also doing for some time here in Pondicherry, is one is suture GART, doing a gonioscopy-assisted transluminal trabeculotomy using a Phioprolin suture, which you see here. And the other one which we are doing is a modification of Cahook's dual blade. Cahook's dual blade is going to be available soon, but we are doing a small modification to that, which I will talk to you. So when we are talking about the suture GART, normally a GART is done using an iTrack microcatheter, which is very expensive. You need the light source and you need to have this disposable iTracks for every case. But we have a less expensive way of doing it using the Phioprolin suture. And it can be cost effective. We have to prove that it is cost effective, but at least in our hands for the last couple of years, we have seen that the efficiency or the effectiveness is very good. What do you need for a suture GART? You need a low temperature cartridge. It's very important to make a small snub in the suture. You need a nice gonioprism, a Swan-Jacob gonioprism to do intraoperative gonioscopy. You need Phioprolin suture, and then an MVR blade. Good viscoelastic, especially Healon GV, is very important. And also these two forceps, MST forceps and McPherson's forceps. This is all you need in addition to what you do for your regular speculum and things like that. So this is a low temperature cautery which you see, and the phyoprolin suture. So initially you use the cautery to make a small snub here so that the sharp end of the suture will not damage the angle structure. So that's how you do that. A small snub is done, and then you keep the suture, and then you make a couple of side ports. One is the main side port and the other is the main port. And if you're doing a phaco, you can do a regular phaco incision, or else you can make a side port like this. After that, you reform the chamber with viscoelastic, and you place the phyoprolin inside, and then position the patient. The positioning is very important. I'll talk to this a little bit later. And using an MVR blade, you make a small nick in the trabecular meshwork to open up the Schlemm's canal. So here you see blood in the Schlemm's canal, so there is a little bit of ooze. So you may have to clear that with viscoelastic and again visualize it. And then using the phyoprolin suture, you enter into the Schlemm's canal and you start catheterizing it. This is where that MST forceps is very important. You have to have a nice hold and grip, and then gently clock hour by clock hour, we should to push the suture. And when you reach 180 degree on the other side, you may have a little bit of resistance. Here, we are trying to do a direct gonioscopy to visualize where exactly the suture is. This is just to show, but it is not really needed unless you have a problem. And then you start continuing the catheterization until you get the suture on the other side of your entry. So normally you can even get 300 to 320 degrees. You catch the one end with your MST forceps, and using a McPherson forceps from the side port, you pull the suture to do the 360 degree goniotomy. This is gonioscopy assisted transluminal trabeculotomy. The other option we have is the Cahook dual blade. So basically it's a goniotomy blade, and it's a removal of trabecular meshwork happens. If you see in a guard, there is a residual trabecular meshwork, but in a trabectome, you also damage the surrounding tissues. Whereas in a KDB, there is complete removal of trabecular meshwork. As a result, there is less fibrosis and better outcome. Let's see how this happens. So KDB is designed like that. It's actually a dual blade. It's brilliantly designed blade. Again, you cannot use it for several patients. You may have to dispose it at the end of every case. There is a sharp tip, and then the sharp tip pierces through the trabecular meshwork into Schlemm's canal. Then the ramp helps you to lift, and then the dual blade does the business of excising the strip of trabecular meshwork. So depending on how many clock hours you want to do, 2 to 3 clock hours, you can do that. So this beautifully does, and then the trabecular meshwork is peeled off. So that is how a Cahook dual blade works. So the sharp end enters through the trabecular meshwork into the Schlemm's canal, and then the ramp lifts it, followed by cutting of the trabecular meshwork by the dual blade. And then you do it on the from the other side so that both the ends meet, and then you can peel off the trabecular meshwork like this. So that is a simple way of doing it, which is called bang, where you actually bend a 26 gauge needle, and you can do the similar technique by bending just the simple needle. So again, gonioscopy is very important. And then through the sharp needle, you pierce the trabecular meshwork, you enter into the Schlemm's canal gently, and then you peel off the trabecular meshwork. You can see the peeled trabecular meshwork here. And then you can do from the other side for the required clock hours you want to meet. So this technique is called bang, a bent ab interno needle goniectomy. So this is also practically possible, and it is very simple. What is more important is intraoperative gonioscopy, positioning the patient. So here you have to turn the patient head away from you and tilt the microscope towards you. And you need high viscosity viscoelastic like Helon GV. And it's good to keep the patient head above the heart so that you tilt the table down, the leg end should be down and the head end should be out, so that you can prevent the blood reflex from the happening into the Schlemm's canal. And very important, you have to counsel the patient about the positioning even before, so that they may not be very uncomfortable. So this is where the head end is on top, and then you apply viscoelastic. You use the Swan-Jacob lens, and then you bring the microscope towards you, tilt the head away from you, and then you visualize the angle like this. So this is good to do even when you are doing a cataract surgery. Start visualizing the angle. Once you start seeing the angle, I'm sure many of these mixed procedures can become very easy to do. To conclude, I would say that mixed has a potential in management of normal tension glaucoma. There are a lot of evidences coming up for iStent and Hydrus in patients who have mild to moderate damage and also who don't have very high pressure, because definitely it reduces the dependency on glaucoma medication. So if you're combining a cataract, you can combine it with mixed and do a cataract surgery. And also you preserve the conjunctiva for future manipulations or future surgery. And definitely at the end of the day, it improves the quality of life of our patients.
Thank you, Dr. Venkatesh. That was very nice. I hope that MIGS really takes up in our country, because it is so expensive. It has really not taken up in our country. I've been doing HFDS for the last 10 years now, and with limited results, because we're only using it in patients who need moderate reduction. You cannot expect to get a big reduction in pressure. With that, I have one more comment to make, because I think Manish talked about doing SLT in NTG patients. And this is just a small comment, Manish, that in NTG patients, you do not get a good fall in intraocular pressure, because SLT works very well when you have high pressures. The higher the pressure, the better the reduction. The lower the pressure, the lower the reduction. So when you're really wanting to treat aggressively, then I think SLT doesn't really do its job. Yes, it can work as an adjunct to the medication that you are using.
Added it in that list because it was used in the CNGT trial.
Correct. I know that, but I'm just adding on to a practical point.
SLT is known to have a control over the diurnal fluctuation. That could be the possibility. That's why it has been used.
Correct. So, we were to do panel discussion of cases. I have a lot of cases ready, but we have to adjust Dr. Arun. So, Dr. Arun will come on now and finish his keynote, and then we'll see how much time we have before we have time to do cases. So, can I request Dr. Arun Narayanswamy to please come on in now and give us your keynote address?
Thank you, Dr. Rita. Thank you, AIOC. Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I go ahead. All very familiar faces. Glad to see you all, and really happy that all of you are safe. Your near and dear ones are safe, and hopefully we get on and get to see each other very, very soon. Now the slide movement. He's done something to my, okay. So no financial disclosures. So angle evaluation is key to glaucoma diagnosis and management. And gonioscopy is our current reference standard. It basically involves the visual inspection of angle structures. However, gonioscopy is fraught with a few issues such as subjectivity, the way we record our findings, and a significant amount of training and expertise which is required to do a good gonioscopy. This is where cross-sectional angle imaging tools have made an impact on our clinical approach and practice. Some of these tools are the ultrasound biomicroscopy and the optical coherence-based platforms, that's the ASOCT, the high-definition OCT, and the SWAP source OCT. Ultrasound biomicroscopy has been a revolutionary technology. It's essentially based on a high-frequency ultrasound B-scan system and delivers very high-resolution images of the anterior chamber and the angle, and especially of the retroiridial space. Until today, there's no other imaging tool that can image the retroiridial space as well as the ultrasound biomicroscope. Now, this really enhanced our knowledge and application in terms of understanding glaucoma better. One important aspect of using or making sense of the ultrasound biomicroscope is the need to identify the scleral spur, which is the most important landmark, and then go on orienting yourself with regard to the angle status. So in terms of once we have identified the scleral spur, any iris contact anterior to the scleral spur to the angle wall represents angle closure or iridotrabecular contact and essentially means angle closure. So overall, the UBM has played an important role in refining and strengthening our concepts. The ability to image the elusive iris-ciliary body complex has allowed us to come up with diagnoses that have been challenging and definitely has helped us modify approach to therapy. Concepts such as relative pupillary block, pigment dispersion syndrome, and plateau iris, as well as aqueous misdirection was better understood. Now, in a situation such as this, iridociliaris can be pretty challenging to diagnose, and an UBM makes it easier. But however, rare diagnosis such as iridociliary tumor is something that only the UBM can give you. In terms of a clinical scenario like this, the clinical diagnosis is fairly straightforward when it's a lens-induced angle closure. However, the UBM adds additional information to the zonular status, and that helps you plan your surgery better, plan the approach better, and eventually have a better outcome. And in a case like this, information about the anterior chamber, the status of the lens, and zonules will definitely help you plan a better surgery, and eventually the patient would have a better outcome. Now, in terms of aqueous misdirection, the UBM has thrown significant light with regard to this aspect. We have recognized there's another entity called as the annular effusion syndrome that looks very much like aqueous misdirection syndrome. And we know that a surgical approach is required when there is when the supraciliary effusion is not present, whereas when the supraciliary effusion is present, a medical approach can be adopted to start with. In a situation like this, again, the status of the anterior chamber would help you decide what is going on with the patient and how to approach this surgically in terms of surgical planning and management of this patient. Moving on to the ASOCT, there have been several generations of this instrument, starting from the time domain platform, moving on to the spectral domain, and then the SWEP source. Essentially, the imaging has moved on from being a low resolution to a high resolution platform, and from being meridional to become circumferential. One of the first platforms we were exposed to is the low coherence interferometry, which had a spatial resolution of 10 to 20 microns. It is a non-contact technology done with the patient sitting up, and the image acquisition is rapid. The one disadvantage with this platform is the inability to image the retroiridial structures. And again, the most important aspect of making sense of an image from this OCT is to identify the scleral spur. This is essentially follows the similar principles as the UBM, a change in the curvature of the angle wall and a point of high reflectivity. And once you've identified it, angle wall contact of the iris anterior to the scleral spur represents angle closure, and the one below here is representative of an open angle. Now, the big question is, what is the consistency of visualizing the scleral spur? It can be as simple as this, or could be as complex as this, and though visually this appears to be an open angle, you're not able to conclusively say that you're located at the scleral spur. So this is the challenge, and the study from Singapore showed that in about 70% of the images, one is able to identify the scleral spur. Now, how does ASOCT perform against gonioscopy? The study from Singapore, again, involving about 203 patients, found that the sensitivity of this procedure, of this imaging tool, is about 98%, whereas the specificity is at about 55%. And what this essentially means is that 45% of the normal populations can still have false positive on the ASOCT and would still need a gonioscopy to confirm closure. Now, the problem of the scleral spur and its definitions was considered, and it was thought that if you increase the resolution, maybe the imaging is likely to be better. And that's where the spectral domain OCT platforms and the Fourier domain OCT platforms came to the picture. However, what they found was they're able to definitely see structures better, but it does not mean that the scleral spur was seen better. We're able to identify structures such as the Schwalbe's line, the trabecular meshwork, the Schlemm's canal. And then what was noted in the analysis was that the structure that was seen most prominently was the Schwalbe's line, and the definition of the scleral spur continued to be around 79 to 80% and still not good enough to be used widely. Circumferential imaging was another aspect of anterior chamber segment imaging, which was thought as something that was lacking, because what the prior ASOCT technologies gave us was just a 10 to 20 microns of cross-section, whereas the swept source technology was able to overcome that and image nearly 360 degrees of the angle. The technology essentially images nearly 128 cross-sections, takes samples from all these areas, and you're able to summarize this using a semi-automated software, using an index called as the iridotrabecular contact index. It's essentially a closed angle, means the ITC index is close to 100%. This essentially means 360 degree closure. The lower the ITC index, more open the angle is. Now, the ASOCT on the whole has given us a broad overview and understanding about angle closure and parameters, and many novel parameters, some of which are the iris parameters, such as iris curvature, iris thickness, and iris area. All of these were noted to be associated with a greater amount of narrowing of the angles and associated with angle closure. What was noted from the Singapore team was that a greater iris curvature, a greater iris thickness, and iris area were significantly associated with the presence of narrow angles. Further, novel parameters such as anterior chamber width, anterior chamber, the lens vault, and all of these parameters had an association with angle closure. So essentially, the summary from what we gain from this is that angle closure glaucoma is not a homogeneous disease. The relative importance of each factor and anatomical factors may be different in different individuals. There may be many subtypes of angle closure according to the different anatomical factors, and individualized treatment is something that we need to start considering. Now, this is a good time to take a step back. If you notice the cost of equipment that you're dealing with, the gonioscopy is as less as 8,000 rupees. And the ASOCT gives you something like this. In comparison, the gonioscopy gives you information that is of greater detail. Now, this is something that we need to step back and look at and use the imaging technologies judiciously. So one other limitation of the imaging technology is the inability to do a dynamic assessment. And gonioscopy, you get these clues that are essentially help you understand pathology better and also help you prognosticate the likely effect of therapy. Now, on an ASOCT, this is just a peripheral anterior synechia, whereas the core information is missing from this information. Now, is this primary or is this secondary? But gonioscopy can tell you this. Now, let us consider this example on the left. If an imaging scan line runs this area, what you get is essentially an open angle on the ASOCT. And if it runs through this area, it's essentially a synechial or angle closure. Whereas when you do gonioscopy, the presence of a simultaneous open area of the angle as well as synechia is clearly indicative of a diagnosis. And in this case, eye syndrome, when you tie it up with the other findings, a typical scalloped broad synechia again is very, very typical of uveitis. And this, you know that which direction you need to head to when you do a gonioscopy. Again, you look at an example like this, the pattern of pigmentation on gonioscopy is straight away gives you a diagnosis, whereas on the ASOCT, this is just an open angle. So what has imaging really added? It's an objective tool. It has helped control illumination-related influences and helps us visualize the iridociliary complex, and added great value in patient education, crucial information to understanding of angle closure in iris, plateau iris, misdirection, and supraciliary effusion. And it does have a significant clinical impact when used judiciously. Gonioscopy skills continue to be crucial and integral part of glaucoma management. We need to continue to learn gonioscopy and continue to practice gonioscopy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Arun. That was very elucid. You had a lot of examples to show us, and it really made the talk very interesting. I am really grateful that we could host your talk. Of course, because we are short of time, we cannot do the.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah.
Don't worry. So we cannot do some case discussions, but I had some really interesting cases, and since I'm getting messages from the headquarters to say that you have run short of your time, I would personally like to thank each and every one of my instructors.
We have 4 minutes. Don't worry. If you want to take.
So can I take one case?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
One? Okay.
We have 4 minutes. Yeah.
Oh, that'll be great.
Yes.
So. Yeah, so we'll just take one good case that I thought I can share with you guys.
If it's taking time to share, you can just speak it out.
Yeah, this is the patient. This is a 77-year-old, very slim female patient who's been following up with me for the last 10 years. She suddenly came with a history of diminished vision, both eyes, slowly over the last year, and she hasn't seen me over the last year because of the COVID. She just came to me some couple of months ago. She's a known diabetic, controlled for the last 25 years. Her vision has always remained at between 6 and 6 in both the eyes. She's pseudophakic. She's been operated for her cataracts about 12 years ago. And she's been on one medication, a prostaglandin, to keep her pressures at where they are. She's got normal corneal thicknesses. Now, because she came with a history of diminished vision, I tried to see, and she's a very sensitive patient. She's an intelligent lady. She could tell me very clearly that she's not as happy as she was. It isn't as if that her vision has really decreased, but she's just not happy with the kind of vision that she has. So I asked her for all the history for progression of NTG. So, whether she has any other medical illness, whether she has had an acute blood loss, whether her vitals are normal. I tried to do everything, but I couldn't get anything. So what we finally did was we did her perimetry, and her right eye, which was actually not showing us a defect before, suddenly started showing me this defect. And so we got a progression done, and we did see that there was a progression, very small one on the right eye and a relatively large one on the left eye on perimetry. But on the OCT, if you see, this is the older OCT on the left side, and on the right side you can see that there is definitely a progression in the GCC on the right eye. Having seen that, I started wondering what I should do, because her pressures are normal. She's absolutely good with her medications, extremely compliant patient. Her son is a diabetologist, so he's been making sure that she is very well looked after. Despite this, I was wondering what should I do next. Do you have any suggestions? Of you has any suggestions?
What was her blood pressure?
Her blood pressure was normal. She had a systemic, her total blood pressure was like 140 by 90. She was not taking any medication for her blood pressure. Interestingly, because we are short of time, I'll just tell you what we did. I was wondering what next to do, so I sent her, got her color Doppler done. That was okay. Because she was diabetic, I thought that maybe she could be having an occlusive ocular perfusion deficit. But that was okay. Then I suddenly thought, now that nothing else is working, let me just put her through the sleep lab. And we put her through the sleep lab, and I was absolutely astonished to see that her apnea hyperapnea index was like markedly abnormal, and she had to be put onto a CPAP. I have only put her, I have not. The physician has now put her onto a CPAP, but today I got a learning lesson from you, Meenakshi, when you said that the patients on CPAP have higher pressures. So the question now is that we know that obstructive sleep apnea does give rise to a progression in glaucoma. We also know that even in normal tension glaucomas, the thing that we can do is to try and keep their pressures under control, and we have to continue to keep their ocular perfusion well. And if sleep apnea obstructs that ocular perfusion for whatever time it does, and the pressure rises, is that not the way to go? Question to all the panelists.
You mean to ask if we should not go via the CPAP treatment route?
Yeah, if CPAP is going to cause a rise in intraocular pressure, while we are trying to increase the ocular perfusion by getting over the sleep apnea, are we then still not trying to control the glaucoma progression, because the pressure is going to keep rising?
But not putting her on CPAP has a lot of systemic implications. So I think we need to treat
Absolutely.
the patient.
I agree. So that's why I thought I'll discuss this case, because this is a really dicey situation now, where I have to put her on CPAP because she has to be controlled. At the same time, what do I do for pressure? I have not checked her pressure
Okay.
because she's just come to 2 months ago. I will definitely look at her pressures henceforth. But I mean, this was a lesson learned today. That's why I thought I'll show this case quickly to you guys.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we're run out of time. Yeah.
When I was trying to read up about sleep apnea, most
Yeah.
of the conclusions that they gave were not very for doing much for sleep apnea. They were still in the dark as to whether it actually is a factor or not. Although prima facie, when we think of sleep apnea, we think that yes, it is contributing to glaucoma. And like when they actually calculated the eye pressure, it was found to be lower. That during sleep, those apneic episodes, the pressure is lower. So I don't know where we are actually
Dr.
heading for.
Dhamankar?
Yeah.
And that's why there is ocular perfusion.
Yeah.
Dr.
ocular
Dhamankar,
perfusion.
let's
Rika,
conclude the
thank
session.
you. I will leave. I have to join the
Yes,
other.
yes, yes. Thank you very much. All.
Nice to see all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you, thank
Mrs.
you.
Dhamankar, Dr. Dhamankar, for leading throughout the session. You were wonderful. And thank you so much, all the speakers.